I like roguelikes. There's just something so satisfying about getting a good run in a roguelike, and a lot of it just comes down to the nature of the genre itself. Since every run is randomized, not every run is going to be a cakewalk. But every once in a while, you do get that perfect run where everything just works out in your favor and you just feel completely unstoppable. On the other hand, you sometimes get runs that just feel completely unwinnable. Just for whatever reason, you aren't able to get something going and you're having to constantly buy health instead of getting upgrades because just nothing is going your way. And these two extremes are interesting to me because typically you would want to avoid these cases in most other genres. But without cases like these, roguelikes wouldn't be nearly as fun as they are. And as you've probably guessed by the title, the way these runs form is largely in part due to feedback loops. Also, just as a quick little side note, I'll be referring to both roguelikes and roguelites as roguelikes just for the sake of simplicity. So, what is a feedback loop? Well, there are two types of feedback loops, positive and negative. Except these don't really do a good job of describing the two types, so I will instead be referring to them as reinforcing and balancing loops. In a reinforcing loops, effects are compounded. This means that positive outcomes will lead to more positive outcomes, and negative outcomes will lead to more negative outcomes. This is also why I hate the terms positive and negative feedback loops, since these would both be considered an example of a positive feedback loop. To put this more simply, you can think of it like this. When you're winning in a reinforcing loop, you'll win more, and when you're losing, you'll lose more. On the other hand, you have balancing loops, where effects are essentially countered. This means that both positive outcomes will lead to negative outcomes, and negative outcomes will lead to positive outcomes until some sort of balance is achieved. In balancing loops, if you're winning and your opponent is losing, then either you will be given a handicap or they will be given a boost until some sort of balance is achieved. Feedback loops, specifically reinforcing loops, are a core part of roguelikes. They're what lead to both god runs and runs that end within 5 minutes. We can categorize most roguelikes to be somewhere on this spectrum. On one end, we have games that are more punishing and you have to try and keep up with the enemies, and on the other hand, we have games where you can easily overpower the enemies or power fantasies. In roguelikes that are more punishing, you want to try and pick up momentum as quickly as possible in your run. Otherwise, the enemies will start to overpower you, and once that happens, it's pretty hard to salvage a run. FTL is a pretty good example of this. In FTL, it is very easy for things to spiral out of control. If you aren't able to get the momentum you need for a good run early on, then it's all over. You want to make sure you're taking as many fights as you can so you can get enough scrap to upgrade your ship. Even when you are taking as many fights as you can, you need to make sure that you're avoiding as much damage as possible. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but there are some fights in FTL where taking damage is basically unavoidable, and so minimizing that damage as much as possible is very important. This is because repairing your hull also uses scrap, so the less damage you take, the more scrap you can use for upgrades. This also means if you're constantly having to spend scrap to repair your ship, then you won't be able to upgrade your ship enough to keep up with enemies in later sectors of the game. Anyway, with all that being said, FTL is the perfect example of a punishing roguelike, and for that reason it goes here on the spectrum. Another good example of a punishing roguelike is Slay the Spire. Like in FTL, you want to make sure you're getting in a good number of fights in Slay the Spire, since these will reward you with cards that you can add to your deck, among other things. And making sure your deck can handle upcoming enemies is a very important aspect of Slay the Spire. Act 2 is a pretty big difficulty spike in Slay the Spire. If you don't have a good deck by the time you reach it, then, well, that's the end of your run. Seriously, you go from enemies that can do this to enemies that can do this. This is even more amplified by the Act 2 bosses, who will completely destroy you if you haven't prepared for them. That being said, you still have a lot of options to help you get a good build. Each fight gives you the option of adding a card to your deck from 3 options, or you can choose to skip them if you feel like none of them add enough value to your deck. There's also campfires which will allow you to restore your health, or upgrade a card. You'll also run into shops that will offer you 7 cards to choose from, 5 for your specific character, and 2 colorless cards that can be used by any character. Shops also allow you to remove a card from your deck, which is great since the cards you start off with won't be doing much for you later on in the game, aside from taking up space in your deck. All these options do allow you to get pretty consistent at getting good runs, and if you're able to deal with the Act 2 difficulty spike, then you're most likely going to be able to deal with Act 3. While Slay the Spire is still on the more punishing side, it's nowhere near as brutal as FTL, which puts it around here on the spectrum. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there are power fantasies. In these games, once you pull ahead of the enemies, you're basically set, and I think few games encapsulate this better than Balatro. Balatro gives you so many ways to get a viable run going that once you know how to play, it's pretty hard to lose a run, at least on the base difficulty. There's obviously jokers which all have different effects that you can take advantage of, but you also have things like tarot cards, which can do different things like adding effects to your cards, changing those cards into different cards, or even destroying unwanted cards entirely. You also have things like planet cards, which increase the multiplier and the amount of chips you receive whenever you play a certain hand. You also have spectral cards, which are basically just upgraded tarot cards, and you also have vouchers, which give you passive upgrades for your run. On top of all this, you get interest at the end of a round as long as you have a certain amount of money, which lets you easily build up your money so long as you're not spending all of it at the end of each round. This lets you buy even more jokers and booster packs to further enhance your build. The combination of all these things leads to a very satisfying feedback loop that mostly ends with me seeing how far I can get in endless mode. Because of this, Balatro is a great example of a power fantasy and goes here. Before ending the video, there is one other game I would like to mention, and it's a game that I can't not mention when talking about feedback loops. Risk of Rain 2 is a game that is not afraid to let you break it. One of its main gimmicks is you're able to grab multiple copies of an item, allowing you to increase their effects. For just one example, take the item Lensmaker's Glasses. These give you a 10% crit chance for your attacks, but if you grab 10 of them, then all of your attacks are crits. This mechanic of being able to grab multiple stacks of items lets you turn a run from this into this. But you're not the only one who gets stronger over time. See, the other main gimmick in Risk of Rain is that as time increases, the difficulty increases. This means that if you're not moving fast enough, the enemies will start to overpower you. This actually shows us both kinds of reinforcing loops, since every second you aren't getting stronger just brings the enemies closer to overpowering you. This effect of two simultaneous feedback loops is amplified even more if you decide to loop back to the starting stage. Basically, in case you haven't played Risk of Rain before, when you reach the stage before the final boss, you're given the choice to either go to the final stage or loop back to the first. If you decide to loop back to the first stage, then you get to keep all of your items, but the enemies will still continue to get stronger. Looping back to the first stage feeds the feedback loop for both you and the enemies. You get the chance to become more powerful by grabbing even more items, but the enemies themselves will also become stronger. You'll even start seeing new elite enemy types, and bosses will begin spawning alongside normal enemies. You'll even start running into scavengers, which are enemies who are able to use items just like you. While I do consider Risk of Rain to be a power fantasy, the fact that the enemies do get stronger over time does balance it out. This puts Risk of Rain close to the center, but it definitely leans more towards the power fantasy side. Obviously, there are many more roguelikes that I can talk about, but these are just the ones that I felt like mentioning. Maybe I'll eventually make a sequel to this video where I talk about more roguelikes, but for now that's really all I had to say. I know this video is a little different than what I usually make, but I had a lot of fun making this, so maybe I'll experiment with more videos of this kind of style, but for now, thanks for watching.